Before God said, "Let there be light," there was something else, a sacred interval, a deep silence full of tension, as if the universe held its breath. It was not just the beginning of time, it was the end of a forgotten era. You are about to delve into one of the greatest secrets ever erased from the spiritual memory of humanity. And if this truth burns in your heart, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. It will cost you nothing, and you will be helping the word of God reach thousands of lost souls. Have you ever wondered why the Bible begins with, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth," but only later in verse 3 does he say, "Let there be light"? What was happening between verse 1 and verse 3? And even stranger, why was the Spirit of God hovering over the waters? What were these waters if creation had not yet been declared? Many theologians ignore this void, but the ancient writings do not. They speak of a movement in the heavens, of a decision that would be costly. Something happened the day before the light. The book of Genesis was not written to hide, but it also does not reveal everything right away. It keeps secrets between the lines, especially in what many call the creation gap. According to ancient scholars such as Origen and other interpreters of the original Hebrew texts, there are hints of a period before the command, "Let there be light," a time of cosmic silence where God's throne was in motion. And the question is, why was God hovering instead of reigning? Jewish mystical tradition mentions a curious term, tohu vabohu, translated as without form and void, but which can also mean devastated and ruined. How can something be ruined before it was even created? This led many to believe that a war had taken place, a rebellion, not of earth, but of heaven. And the Spirit of God hovered not for aesthetics, but for judgment. He observed what had been destroyed before deciding that the light needed to return. There is a gap that has puzzled scholars for centuries. Between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, something seems to have happened. In one instant, God creates the heavens and the earth. In the next, all is in chaos and darkness. This sequence is not accidental. In the ancient texts, darkness symbolizes judgment. The Spirit hovering over the waters indicates not only creation, but a kind of mourning, as one surveys the wreckage of something precious. The verb hovered in Hebrew, rachaf, suggests fluttering, anxious movement, almost like the flapping of a wounded bird's wings. Some ancient rabbis, such as Rashi, suggested that something was destroyed before the light was pronounced. An early attempt at creation, a spiritual civilization that failed. The Apocrypha, such as the Book of Enoch, speak of angels who fell before humanity, of a plan that was corrupted. What if the abyss over which the Spirit hovered was the wake of that judgment? A remnant of the first fall, still echoing in the void of creation. This idea is heightened when we read Isaiah 45:18. God did not create the earth to be a wasteland, tohu, but to be inhabited. So why does it appear in Genesis as a wasteland? Something made it that way, and what followed was not just the beginning of the world, but a restoration. God, like an artist facing a stained canvas, decides to start over. But he doesn't erase everything, he redeems it. He brings light, but he doesn't hide the waters. The waters were there. The darkness was there too, but the light had not yet been called, and in this interval, a mystery looms. Some scholars call this the interrupted creation, a work that was begun but distorted by spiritual forces that rebelled before man existed. This rebellion, according to some readings of Ezekiel 28 and Isaiah 14, would have occurred in the heart of a being who shone but chose darkness. And so, the earth, still without form, bore the scars of a story that few dare tell. Ezekiel 28 describes an anointed cherub placed in Eden, perfect in his ways, until iniquity was found in him. But this Eden described is not the Garden of Genesis 2, it is a heavenly Eden, adorned with precious stones, with priestly functions and glory. This suggests that there was a spiritual reality prior to the physical creation, an Eden above where heavenly beings dwelt, and there one of them exalted himself. His fall did not occur before Adam, but long before the clay was molded. This being, later identified as Lucifer by Christian tradition, did not fall out of envy of man, but out of pride before God. Isaiah 14 says, "I will ascend into heaven, I will be like the Most High." This desire predates the creation of humanity. It means that the first rebellion took place before the light was called forth, before human time existed. The day before Genesis was the scene of a heavenly war, and the wreckage of that battle was still hovering over the waters when the Spirit moved. The silence between the verses of Genesis is, in fact, an echo of this conflict, a hiatus where the heavens were shaken and the earth, or whatever existed as a material base, became a field of spiritual ruins. It is no coincidence that God's first creative act after this chaos is to invoke light. Not sunlight, since the sun is only created on the fourth day, but a spiritual light, a restorative presence that separates darkness from order, chaos from purpose. It was the beginning of a new time. This light, mentioned in verse 3, is called by the Jews the primordial light, a pure light prior to the stars, a direct manifestation of the glory of God. It not only illuminates but separates what came from rebellion from what will be redeemed. It is the first divine response to that which had been corrupted. And in saying, "Let there be light," God is not only creating, He is decreeing. The time of restoration has begun, but the echoes of the fall would still need to be faced. Kabbalistic tradition teaches that before creation as we know it, God emanated infinite light into vessels called Sephirot, but the vessels could not bear this glory, and they shattered. This event is called the shattering of the vessels, Shevirat HaKelim, a symbolic but powerful image, the idea of a spiritual creation that collapsed under the weight of the divine presence itself. If this is a shadow of the spiritual reality before Genesis, then the initial chaos is the consequence of a glory that was mismanaged or rejected. From that point on, everything changes. God's plan is not destroyed, it is restarted, but this time with a new protagonist, man, a being who, unlike the celestials, would not start from above, but from the dust. Fragile, yes, but full of purpose. Adam emerges not as the first conscious being, but as a symbol of future redemption, and by molding man from the earth, God was, in fact, opening a new path, a creation that would learn to choose the light, even though it came from the dust. This is why the order of the days of creation carries so much weight. God separates, organizes, and sets boundaries, the exact opposite of what happened to previous beings. Spiritual rebellion broke boundaries, tried to ascend above the throne. Human creation, however, begins with clear boundaries, separate waters, distinct light and darkness, demarcated heavens and earth. The world that God forms for Adam is a clear response to the collapse of the world that came before. But still, traces of the past remain. The serpent that appears in Eden is not just an animal. It is already cunning, it speaks, and it knows too much. It was already there. This confirms what many scholars conclude. Man's enemy was not born in Eden. He came from before, from another dimension, from another history, the history of the day before Genesis, when chaos reigned and judgment hung over the waters. Eden was just the second chapter of an ancient war. Eden, then, was created not just as a paradise, but as a testing ground. A protected, fenced-in environment where man would be tested, not just for obedience, but for loyalty amid the influence of an already existing evil. The forbidden fruit was more than a symbol of knowledge. It was the line that separated man from his previous rebellion. God was saying, "You need not repeat the fall I saw before the light." But history, sadly, repeated itself. By choosing to listen to the serpent, Adam not only disobeyed, he revived the echo of the first fall. That is why the consequences were so immediate and severe. The expulsion from Eden was not just a punishment, but a protection against something greater, the risk that man, now in sin, would eat of the tree of life and perpetuate a corruption similar to that which once destroyed the first heavenly orders. The flaming sword that guards the garden is not just symbolic. It is a reminder of the spiritual warfare that preceded it all. This is why Revelation echoes Genesis. The biblical narrative begins with chaos and ends with judgment. At the end, there is a new heaven, a new earth, and a city where there is no more darkness. The light that God said, "Let there be," in Genesis 1:3, returns in Revelation as the glory of the Lamb that illuminates everything. It is a cycle. What began as restoration ends in consummation, and it all makes sense only when we understand what came before. The silence filled with glory and loss. The day before Genesis is not a poetic metaphor. It is a spiritual reality that shapes the entire Bible. It is the reason the earth was already covered in water and darkness. It is why the history of humanity bears the scars of a war we did not start. And it is also the reason God always acts with grace and justice. He saw the previous fall, and yet he decided to start over, to create anew, to give the dust the chance to become his son. If we understand this perspective, we realize that Genesis is not the absolute beginning of all things, but the new beginning of that which was tainted. The creation of man is the beginning of a plan of redemption. God did not need to create again. He chose to do so, because even after the heavenly rebellion, he did not give up on his purpose. Human creation emerges as the response of a God who decided to love again, to trust again, even knowing what freedom can cause. This context also gives new meaning to Jesus' mission. He did not come merely to redeem Adam's sin. He came to overcome that which caused the fall before Adam. John writes that the Son of God was manifested to destroy the works of the devil, works that existed before man. Christ does not merely enter the history of humanity. He steps onto the spiritual field of an age-old war. He is the original light that shines in the darkness, the same light that God spoke in the beginning. That's why the New Testament speaks so much of light and darkness. It's not just moral or symbolic language, it's a return to the primal conflict. Paul says we've been translated out of the realm of darkness into the kingdom of light. Peter speaks of declaring the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. The language is not new, it's the continuation of a decree that began when God said, "Let there be light," a response to the fall that preceded man. Thus, each verse of Genesis becomes a window into something deeper. We are reading not only about the origin of the physical world, but about the beginning of a spiritual realm. The waters, the darkness, the spirit hovering, the light appearing, these are all clues left by God for those with spiritual eyes. What happened before creation has not been forgotten, just sealed. But in our day, the seal is beginning to be broken, and the ancient mysteries are coming to light again. The idea that there was something before the creation of man may seem strange to some, but it is suggested at various points in Scripture. Job 38:7 states that the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy when the foundations of the earth were laid. Who were these sons of God? They were there before the world existed. This confirms that there was conscious spiritual life before our creation. A heavenly audience witnessed the birth of the earth, and perhaps before that, its fall. These sons of God are the same ones who appear in Genesis 6, Job and Psalm 82, as beings distinct from humanity, participants in a heavenly plan. Some remained faithful, others, according to Enoch and other ancient traditions, rebelled, leaving their original home. This leads us to a disturbing conclusion. The chaos described at the beginning of Genesis may have been the result of the fall of these beings. The Spirit was hovering over waters that had not been called, perhaps the waters of spiritual destruction. It is important to remember that the Bible does not deny these spiritual layers. It merely reveals them according to the maturity and revelation of each era. Jesus himself said to his disciples, "I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now." In other words, there are truths that are only revealed with discernment, and perhaps this is one of them. What God restored in creation was more than matter. It was a reconciliation of worlds, a reopening of history after an ancient celestial bankruptcy. And in creating man, God was not just beginning something new, he was planting a living response to the earlier rebellion. Man, made in his image, would be proof that voluntary worship was still possible, that light could triumph where there had been darkness. Paradise, the garden, the breath, all these are signs of hope, but also of war. For the ancient serpent, which fell silent before the light, still moved among the trees. This serpent is mentioned again in Revelation 12 as the great dragon, that ancient serpent, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. Note, he was already ancient in the time of Genesis. He didn't just appear in Eden. He already had a history and an agenda. His presence there was no accident, but part of a much older drama, a drama that began when a heavenly being decided to exalt himself above the Most High, and was cast down. And where was he thrown? Revelation 12:9 says, "He was thrown to the earth, and his angels were thrown with him." This reinforces the idea that when God began to order the earth in Genesis 1, it was already the scene of a spiritual exile. The earth was the field where those who rebelled were thrown, and man was created in the midst of this field, not as a victim, but as a witness and a response. God's plan was greater, to prove that love, even in the midst of darkness, could win. This truth changes everything. We are not just creatures made of dust. We are a living response to the ancient fall. We are the reflection of a glory that God chose to reveal even in a world marked by rebellion. We are chosen to manifest light in the midst of darkness, not only of human sin, but of the spiritual war that began before time. Every breath of man is an affront to the pride of those who fell before the light was spoken. And that is why the Bible is, from beginning to end, a narrative of light versus darkness, of redemption versus rebellion. The story of Genesis is not childish nor simplistic. It is profound, cosmic, spiritual, a new beginning after the collapse. And we are at the center of this new creation, not as spectators, but as heirs, as children who have been generated in the heart of God to restore, together with Christ, what was lost in the silence of the day before creation. The Apostle Paul understood this hidden dimension when he wrote that, "In Christ all things, in heaven and on earth, would be brought together again." Ephesians 1:10. He was speaking of cosmic reconciliation, not just human forgiveness. God's plan was always greater than redeeming man. It was to restore harmony to all creation, correcting the disorder that began before the first ray of light illuminated matter. That is why in Romans 8, Paul says that creation groans, waiting for the revealing of the children of God. These groans are not just from the physical nature, but from a spiritual reality that has been crying out for justice since the days of the ancient fall. We are called not only to believe, but to understand, to see beyond the visible and realize that our existence is intertwined with a war that began before time and will end in eternity. The day before Genesis teaches us that chaos is not the end, but the beginning of divine intervention. That even when all seems lost, God is still hovering over the waters. That before any light dawns, there is a silent, whispered decree: I am still here. And when that decree becomes word, all darkness must retreat, because the light that once shone over the heavenly ruins still shines today in the hearts that recognize him. Phrase of the day: before God said, "Let there be light," he had already decided to love us. If this touched your heart, comment, "I choose the light that overcomes chaos." And don't forget, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this message with someone who needs a reminder that God always creates, even after collapse. See you in the next video.